It's been almost a week since National Signing Day. Auburn putting together its 5th signing class under head coach Gus Malzahn, and on AL.com, James Crepea joining me now. Broke those 5 seasons down. And James, I want to know from you, when you dig a little deeper into this, what was your biggest takeaways of these 5 signing classes under Coach Malzahn?
Well, when you have a sample that large, especially the first 4, obviously this last one that just got together, we don't have much other than the fact of where they're from and how they rank. But for the first 4 in particular, you start to see some trends develop, in particular over the first 3 years specifically. As far as players, when they reached outside their footprint of Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, both some great successes as well as some big disappointments there. And that was I think, probably the biggest takeaway of the overall group thus far, especially the first, again, mainly 3 years of the 5. But you can point out a Daniel Carlson, who's a 2-time finalist for the Lou Groza, a Braden Smith, who's from Kansas, who's been a fantastic 2-year starter for them at guard, set to be a 3rd-year starter for them next year. They've had some great players, and Cameron Artis-Payne led the SEC in rushing, was outside of that footprint. But they've also had a Javon Robinson, a Tequil Williams, and Elijah Daniel who've come forth and been very big disappointments in that standpoint. Now, that said, 2 of those 3 were junior college transfers, where you kind of knew going in that there was a bit of a inherent risk involved. But nevertheless, when they've stepped outside that footprint, there's been success and there's also been some failure. But there's some other trends as well, looking at by position, and in particular where you look at defensive backs, a lot of departures in that group, which we obviously had known over the last several years, in particular when Will Muschamp and Travaris Robinson came in a couple of years ago. They really overhauled that group personnel-wise. And you can see not just the departures, but also the kind of player at times that the different coaching staffs were looking for at certain positions, as far as height, as far as weight, just build, not only the caliber of stars, for the most part, that was relatively consistent. The biggest difference was, again, more as far as what fits the mold for what Auburn looks for in a linebacker, what fits the mold for what they look for in a defensive back. Offensive line, even though there's been a change in coach, hasn't seen a departure as of yet over the past 5 years. So there's some surprises in there, but again, mostly trends as far as what they're looking for, even with changes in coaching staff. Even a wide receiver, you look and say, all right, Cody Burns has only been here for just under a year. Damian Craig was a fantastic recruiter for Auburn when he was here. He did most of his recruiting at the wide receiver position in Florida and in Georgia. And he didn't recruit Alabama very heavily for that position. He did it for other positions, but just not as heavily for wide receiver. Well, this year, Auburn's 2 wide receivers come from the state of Alabama. It's very early to tell, is that a trend going forward for Cody Burns as the new wide receivers coach, that he's going to rely more in state, in particular with Chip Lindsey as the new offensive coordinator, or was it just an anomaly that it was this year? We'll have to see in the years to come.
Yeah, very interesting breakdown. Of course, you can see that on AL.com. Now, my question for you going into this 2017 signing class, of course, not too many surprises. Auburn was able to pick up some of their bigger targets, Calvin Ashley, Marcavius Bryant. What are your thoughts? What's your overall opinion of this signing class?
Well, it certainly stacks up pretty well as far as compared to Gus's other classes now that we've got 5 together. Look, I think the first-year class, which was always that transitional class, is actually going to stack up pretty well from a standpoint of, yes, there were some players in there, particularly from the junior college ranks. Again, you had some great successes. Cameron Artis-Payne, Nick Marshall, obviously were fantastic additions. And you bring in a Carl Lawson, Montrevious Adams. Having that kind of group alone is pretty big, in particular in a transitional year. Yes, there were also junior college players who were not as successful. There are also players who transferred who weren't as successful. That's going to happen at every program pretty much every year. You're going to have highs and lows, but the highs of that transitional year in particular were extraordinary. I think the 2014 class will end up being not quite as strong on paper. But this year for the 2017 class, I think it's probably toward the middle of the mix, at least on paper heading into it compared to Malzahn's other classes. My bigger question for them is where it stacks up. It's going to stack up entirely based on Jarrett Stidham and his performance. Where he ends up, how he ends up playing, and how he ends up performing is going to dictate how good this class is looked at in the years to come.
James, thank you so much. Great insight as always. We appreciate your time. And for all your Auburn Tiger updates, you can visit us on AL.com.